Hey, do you happen to have any friends or family members or folks you encounter who see things differently than you? Of course you do, right? We are people who engage with other people, which means we are people who wrestle through how we forgive other people. Forgiveness. We keep facing it as we're in relationship with people. What makes it even harder is that we often confuse forgiveness with things that are not forgiveness. You see, when we forgive, we're not saying it was okay. When we forgive, we're not granting permission to continue that behavior. When we forgive, it isn't always that we forgive and forget. Sometimes we very intentionally remember what has happened, moving forward with healthy boundaries. Forgiveness is different than reconciliation. Sometimes relationship is restored, but sometimes it is not. When we forgive, it's not because they deserve it, or whether they understand, or whether they have apologized or not. It's not based on what they have or have not said or done. Those things can matter to us, but that's different than forgiveness. Because according to the Jesus story, forgiveness is something we do on our side of what's happened. And we do it in the flow of God's radical forgiveness for us. And the Jesus story is clear. Forgiveness is God's vision for the world. Because forgiveness is when you set someone free and find out it's you. Which is why this season at Salt House, we open up a conversation about forgiveness. What it is, how we do it, why it's hard, and why it matters. We'll dig into scripture, we'll hear stories from our Salt House community, voices from our wider culture and world. We're calling it Regarding Forgiveness. So show up, bring your questions and your hurts, and join the conversation as we position ourselves for forgiveness together.
Salt House, we are in for a treat this morning because my dear friend Bill Clark is here to speak with us today. If you know Bill Clark, there's three things that you know about him that if you've been seen by him, you've been seen with kindness. There's a deep kindness in this man's eyes. If you have been heard by this man, you have been heard with a deep understanding. There's a deep understanding in this man's ears. And if you have heard him speak, then surely you have heard his heart, because he speaks from a deep place in his heart. And these are three things that equate to a bridge builder in the world. And this is what Bill Clark does, essentially. He bridges these chasms that seem like just unbridgeable chasms to most people, between progressives and evangelicals, between liberals and conservatives, between East and West. He spent 10 years in China. He and his wife, Julie, was here today. Welcome. Spent 10 years in China and another 10 or more in Kazakhstan. And there they learned the Uyghur language. And you've probably heard about the Uyghurs in the news in this past year. They're a minority, a religious Muslim minority group in China and Kazakhstan, around that region, who've been facing tons of persecution. And learning this language has put him in this unique place to be an advocate for these friends. So we say here at Salt House that we value story, and that stories matter. And it's my prayer that this morning, as Bill tells us about his story, that it also bleeds into our story, as it bleeds into the Jesus story. And somehow, in this alchemy of these three, that healing and transformation happens. Somehow, in the healing of our stories, as we look back upon them, that the Holy Spirit will do some of that work, begin that work in us today. So will you give a warm welcome, Salt House welcome to Bill?
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
That was a very kind introduction. Thank you. With that, we have some special friends. This last Friday, I was having coffee with my friend Ablakim. Ablakim and his wife Nurijahan are there. Do you guys want to stand up and can we welcome them? They're from northwest China, that region that Ryan just mentioned, and they have many of their loved ones, people that they grew up with, relatives, are in the concentration camps that have proliferated in this part of China. The Chinese government has incarcerated 1.8 million citizens, ordinary folks from teenagers to seniors in their 80s. And it's one of the worst human rights crises on planet Earth right now. It is the most policed, dystopian region on our planet now. Maybe Gaza is the only place that would be similar. So please just have that on your map. Pray for this region. Read about it. It's if you just Google Uyghur, you'll find New York Times has been covering it very, very well. That's Uyghur. It's unusual spelling. Okay, hang in there, guys, while I get into my. When I was invited to come speak to you about forgiveness, I knew right away what I was going to talk about. And that's my relationship with my father, Bob Clark. And as we heard earlier in the introduction about forgiveness, the families that we grow up in, the relationships that form between parents and children, they're at the core of who we are. I had the privilege of being trained as an anthropologist at UW. And the whole socialization process, scholars feel that at least 90% of our socialization happens in families. So and it's such a God thing, too, because how many of you got to choose your parents? Right? None of us. None of us. And so it's a real coming to terms in many ways. So I want to tell you a story about a father and son. And it's an old story because of the nature of our human family. It's old because it's ancient and that goes all the way back to the beginning. Many of us love the story of the prodigal in Luke 15. I have to say that is my favorite passage in the Bible. And it's often talked about the prodigal son. You've heard it called that. I like to call it the prodigal love of the Father. And that's a whole nother sermon. That's a whole nother, and it's beautiful. Get into it yourself. But for me, that describes the best father in the world. And remember, our God is father and mother. But that parable is the archetype parable. So a little bit about my dad. He was born in 1922. His natural parents divorced soon after his birth, and he was placed in an adoption home. And you'll love the name of this home in San Francisco. It's called the Central Committee on Homeless Children. Where did they get that name? Central Committee, it sounds like out of Moscow or something. But here's what was written on my dad's, on the form letter. Not a form letter, but the letter from the adoption center. It said, parents divorced, period. Father claims child is not his, period. Mother has not been heard from since, period. And we know he was there 2 years until Cecil and Bessie Clark from Stockton, California, adopted him. Aren't those beautiful names? Cecil and Bessie. I wish we could go back in time, and I never had the privilege of meeting them. They were, Bessie was alive, and I think I was 1 or 2 when she died. They were a childless couple, would have loved to have had children, but they were in their late 30s when they adopted him. They were both Oregon State grads. So Bob grew up in a comfortable middle-class home in Stockton, attended the Methodist Church with his parents. Cecil worked as a manager in a fruit packing company there and had a good, stable job. Bob was active on his high school swim team, joined the Naval Flight Program that was offered to high school-age boys at that time. He drove his father around town, and in an unfortunate incident, he was driving his dad there was a strike at the fruit packing company there in Stockton. Remember, this is in the 1930s and the early 40s in our nation, there was a strong conflict between labor and management. And so the labor at the fruit packing company were striking. And so the way Dad tells the story is that people were converging on the car as he was driving his dad to work. And so he was fearing for their safety, so he put it in low and just kept on going and injured some of the strikers. So later the police knew exactly where he lived and brought him before the judge. So he was arrested as a 17-year-old. And the judge looked at him, and I think the judges all over America got the directive from on high. And the judge said, Bob, you've got 2 choices. You can do some time in the county jail, or you can join the service. And I think this is World War II was already in full swing in both the Pacific and the European theaters. And so Dad joined the Army and was almost immediately, we think of going to boot camp. He did his boot camp in the Philippines. So they put him on a troop ship that went to Hawaii and then on to the Philippines. And shortly thereafter, December 8th was when World War II came to the Philippines. December 7th in Hawaii, a day etched in our nation's history. The American forces, there were 40,000 troops. They held out for and fought various battles for 4 months until April, when Douglas MacArthur, the commanding general-in-chief, ordered a surrender. And so he left one of his generals there for the surrender. He left in a submarine. And interestingly, my dad was a military police and was part of General MacArthur's bodyguard there. And lots of stories around my dad and his time there. Soon after being captured, the American soldiers were packed into a POW camp outside Manila. One night, 2 of his bunkmates above him, they were packed many bunks high. They got into a knife fight. So you can imagine the stress that these soldiers were in. They've been fighting for 4 months, low on food, the horrible nature of having to surrender to the enemy from their perspective. It was very violent, and the Japanese military code looked down upon people who surrendered. And so the culture in these camps were very violent. So above him, two of his American Army buddies got into a knife fight, and they actually killed each other. And if you can imagine the horror of that. And So my dad wept that night. And he said after that he made a decision that he was never going to cry again. And that was at the start of a 3.5-year incarceration. So I believe him when he said he never cried again. So the war ended. One quick story is that they got back to San Francisco on the troop ship. They were in Manila for a while, and they got back to San Francisco, and he calls home and says, "Dad, it's me, Bob." And his dad hadn't heard him. His dad didn't believe him. Couldn't recognize his voice. So he goes to the chaplain. And so Dad had left his Christian faith. His upbringing did not prepare him for the trauma of war, for the suffering that he saw around him. And he decided that I don't think he ever was an atheist. I think he was simply mad at God. And he hadn't read the scriptures. He didn't know the scriptures well enough to know about lament, to know about the history of the suffering of the people of God, things that I've been privileged to learn about. So he walked away from the church. And he said that this is the only good thing that a chaplain did for him. The entire war was to pick up the phone and call Cecil and say, "That actually was your son who just called. He is here. Come get him." So he comes home and he hasn't slept on a bed for almost 4 years. So Bessie comes in and checks on him the first night. And she screams because no one's in the bed. She says, "Where are you?" He's sleeping on the floor because he's been sleeping on thin mats, if that. And so it was a big adjustment. So this whole idea of PTSD, trauma, they didn't use those words in 1945. But if there was ever a candidate for Army veteran who had PTSD, it was Bob Clark. So what was it like growing up in that home? My mom, her name is Sabra. They both passed. They had 5 children. I'm the second born, the oldest boy. I have 3 sisters. It was an emotional roller coaster. The physical beatings, Dad was violent. So part of storytelling, just I'm have to tell the whole story. I want to honor you with the whole story this morning. So physical beatings began when I was in kindergarten and continued till I was 11 or 12. The most common form of punishment was whipping with the belt, where he would take his belt off and just. And it was the older 3. It was my older sister, myself, and my next sister. He also banged my head against the wall. And his word were to give me something to cry about. And one horrible day, he grabbed me and he bit my hand. So I was very ashamed of this behavior as a boy. And I wouldn't breathe a word of it to anybody except in brief occasions to my mother. I hated him. I hated him with an uncomplicated passion. He and my mom fought often. And as I mentioned, home life was a roller coaster. Emotional roller coaster. It's Martin Luther King weekend. Tomorrow is our national holiday. And as a nation, we remember a great American. And a brother, and a Christian brother. For many white families, however, following the lead of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, Martin Luther King at that time was pictured as a dangerous, subversive person. One of the worst things that you could call someone, especially coming out of the 50s, where we had the Red Scare in this country, was to call someone a communist. And so he was routinely called a communist, and so that was this was another part of growing up with Bob Clark. His overt racism in the home. It was an ugly cancer in his soul. And it's like an infection. Racism is illogical, non-rational. It's understandable, but we have to push back against it. And our nation's made some great progress. And honoring Martin Luther King is one of the best things that we've ever done as a country. But growing up in a home where racism has been part of the family culture, it's like being infected with a disease. And I've been trying to get healthy and trying to recover from that disease. During my adult life. Many of you have shared that journey with me. I want to share one particular morning. I was a junior in high school, and it's one of those mornings that our family will never forget. So I had one of my chores was to get the paper, the Los Angeles Times, and bring it in, and maybe I forgot it that morning. It's that part I don't really remember. But Dad got all into this is one of those times where he just snapped. And he said, "I'm so angry at you." He said that to me. "I'm going to go get my gun and shoot you." He had at least half a dozen guns hidden around the house. So Dad's trauma became our family trauma that morning. And of course, there was growing up with him. But that sort of was that single incident that sort of summarized it for my siblings and I. So my mom pushed me out of the door that morning. And I skipped school. And I hid in a canyon near our house. And I had a Bible with me. And somehow came to Psalm 27. And I got to verse 10. And Jason, do we... Oh, it's printed in our bulletins. Okay, excellent. So if you want to look at that in your bulletin. Does anyone have an extra bulletin? Right, thank you. Verse 10 says, though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. Teach me your way, Lord. Lead me in a straight path because of my oppressors. Do not turn me over to the desire of my foes, for false witnesses rise up against me, spouting malicious accusations. I remain confident of this: I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. Can we get an amen? Amen. Yeah. The word of the Lord. Something happened to me that morning in that canyon. There was a big pipe culvert, and I was able to snuggle in there, and it was uncharacteristically raining in Los Angeles. And when I got to that part, when my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will take me up. Something happened in my soul. And the fatherhood and the motherhood of God just like came. And I felt like, okay, God is inviting me into his family to be her beloved child. And I just knew it. Sometimes the Holy Spirit can take part of Scripture, maybe that you've read 100 times, but he said, right there, at that moment, because of the circumstances of life, that's for you. That's for you. And that's what happened to me that morning. And that's been with me every day since then. Every day. Not that there haven't been some really hard days. Oh, I knew my Creator had taken me up. Okay. So we were part of an Episcopal parish growing up, but we didn't go. We weren't churchgoers. Studying anthropology in graduate school, I learned the term folk, and folk Buddhist, folk Muslim, and we have in our nation folk Christians. What's a folk Christian? A folk Christian is, I think, someone who identifies with the religion, maybe goes to church once a year, if that. And so in our home, we didn't have a Bible. We didn't ever pray over meals. So we were that. But if you'd asked my parents, are you Christians? They would have said yes. Yes. So that's the background that I grew up in. So at 15, a pretty girl from high school invited me to a Young Life camp. How many of you have heard of Young Life? Yeah, many of you here. Yeah. And I learned how to pray at Young Life camp. And so the connection with my dad is that after I came back from Woodleaf camp as a teenager, the hatred that I'd mentioned earlier for my dad, I could not find it anymore. It was gone. Or at least it wasn't on the surface where I was experiencing life as a teenager. To this day, I have no idea how to explain that. But before I could have tapped into just to hating him at any time, and afterwards, no. And so I know theologically, I've been forgiven. You know, we have embedded in the Lord's Prayer, our archetypal prayer for us Jesus followers, where Jesus teaches us to pray, forgive as we have been forgiven. I experienced that with my dad. And it was remarkable, and it showed up in very dramatic ways where I stopped treating him with hatred. I began to learn how to be present with him and sit with him. And my other siblings still were in that place of estrangement, of hatred for him. Fast forward to 1979. Julie and I were married. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary last June. Yeah. So that was a great day. We had a party actually, and Nur Jahan and Abla Kim were at our celebration party in Everett. That was a really great day. But something happened after I got married. And I began to reflect behavior that my dad had modeled. I began to rage. I began to be irrational. I was moving into the roles that my dad had occupied as a husband and as a father. And it was frightening. Frightening. For me. And Julie, what about you? She said, who is this person that she has married? And thank you. Thank you for bearing with me and forgiving me. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Because I had some bad behavior. And children came 4 years later. Our son Michael is followed in our missionary footsteps and lived in India 7 years, met his wife there who's Bolivian, and they have two kids. So when I became a dad, some of that behavior continued in terms of the father-son. And I got very, very desperate. Very desperate. And I got some help from counselors and from groups of brothers. Fortunately, where we lived we were in Kazakhstan by that time, and I would meet weekly with other men. And in our family, we had between Julie and I, we had a pact. It was a no anger. It was a zero tolerance. Zero tolerance. Where if I crossed the line and became angry, I was the issue. And the kids, my 3 kids, learned the phrase, Dad's the issue. If they acted up and I responded in anger, they got to say, Dad's the issue. So they were kind of into that. And then if I shouted, I got fined. And whoever I shouted with, I had to give them cash. So we had some fun there. But it really helped. It really helped just to bring it all out into the open. And we began to talk as a family culture about this whole theme of forgiveness. Because I'd asked their forgiveness a lot. And for Julie and I, if we had to talk about the characteristics of our 3 children, one of the things we would say is that they are the best forgivers in the whole world. And they will tell you that they're good at that too. So that was not part of either one of our family cultures that we grew up in. Okay, so this whole idea of, as I was dealing with my own stuff, dealing with my relationship with Dad, how did I, and I'd have to keep forgiving him. I'd have to keep forgiving him. Because as I saw the brokenness in my own life, I wanted to lay it at his feet and say, I'm this way, Dad, Bob, because of you. And so I had some real anger for him. So it didn't happen once, twice. It's like peeling an onion, the whole forgiveness process. I think with these deep archetypal relationships with parents. So I kept forgiving him. And I was under I wanted to share this piece as well. I was under I see it now as a misunderstanding. I thought that he had to acknowledge his brokenness. I thought that he had to acknowledge his bad behavior and confess that to me so that I could complete that exchange. Are you with me? That's not, can you see that that's not accurate? Because then I'm still beholden to him. I'm waiting for him. No. We, brothers and sisters, we do not need to wait for anybody to forgive them. Because if we don't forgive them, me not forgiving my dad meant that I was still in bondage. I was still wrapped up. So somehow that cleared up. And I think, in my late 30s, early 40s. So it took a while. But bitterness of the soul is the alternative. And Hebrews 13 talks about the consequences of not forgiving. And they're not pretty. They're not pretty. So we're going to have time after the service for if God is touching you, speaking to you, if there's people in your life that are coming to mind that you need some help in forgiving, we want to pray. We want to pray. So I want to bring this story to conclusion in terms of my dad's piece. 1987, my dad was 65. And my mom asked him to leave the home. And so he did, and spent the next 18 years of his life single, living in an apartment less than a mile from the family home. It turned out he had some addiction issues to sleeping pills and alcohol, so he went into a treatment program. He got sober. He started going to support groups at the Veterans Hospital of other POWs. And he began for the first time to find peer groups where he could bring his past out into the open. He could take the shame and bring it into the light. And he began to get healthy. It wasn't a straightforward process, but so he had about 5 years to live when his kidneys failed, and he needed dialysis. And can any of you remember there was an Academy Award, it won the Best Picture, and I'm forgetting what year, but it was a while ago, 15, 20 years, called As Good as It Gets. Jack Nicholson, Helen Hunt. I'm seeing some nods. Some of you remember that. Yeah. Brilliant movie. And Jack Nicholson was a quirky guy who would go into restaurants and have very definite needs. And he was single-lived, so he didn't cook. And that was my dad. He ate at least 2 meals a day out in restaurants, and he had his favorites. And he did have a waitress who was like the Helen Hunt character. They were actually quite close. Her name was Betty. And don't get me going about Betty, because I love Betty. So we were in Seattle. We were home. As a missionary family, we would come and go and like on furloughs. And Julie's mom had Alzheimer's at that point, so we were up here from 2002 to 2004 when this happened. And so I call our a church that's very close to us. It's a 4-square church, a Pentecostal church in Pasadena, and say, will you help take care of my dad? And in this time, he needs some food because he can't get out to the restaurants. So 5 families in that church said yes. And they organized a food, bringing him food. And they'd bring like a whole bunch once a week. One of the families was from Japan. And they weren't Japanese Americans. The husband was a scientist who had come to Caltech and become a Christian. And he and his wife were at the church. So they started coming every month. And my dad was still estranged from my sister, who was the only sibling in LA. My sister has 2 kids, so he didn't see his own grandkids. Now these 2 beautiful Japanese kids started calling him Grandpa. And my dad started opening up. One day he said to them, I used to live in Japan, because he spent part of the war working as slave labor with Nippon Steel. And finally, then he said that he was actually indeed a POW. And he learned through this family to forgive the Japanese people for the horror and the trauma that he experienced as a young adult. And that was how forgiveness happens. And then in that last year of life, when he was in the VA hospital, 2 different pastors. One is a Latino pastor from that church, Ralph Torres, who I will love to the day I die. And then Samuel Shu, a Chinese American pastor. They both came and prayed with him. So Dad's white supremacy, his racism, was crumbling. His senior doctor, Dr. William, and can we get that slide up, Jason? Yeah. So there's Bob. There's Dad. And there's Dr. William, a very accomplished internal medicine doctor in the VA system, and general in the reserves. He loved my dad. My dad had a way with people that shocked us children. Shocked us, because he could actually be charming and friendly, and then especially in those years after he got healthy. And Dr. William said he loved my dad so much that he said, you can bypass the nurses, you can bypass the receptionists, you can come right to my office. And not many doctors say that. So that by the time Dad died in 2005, Julie and I were back in Kazakhstan. I flew home, and I had the privilege of doing his funeral. He was reconciled to all my siblings. He was reconciled to my mom. My mom, he was in the hospital 10 months until he died, and visiting him every week became the highlight of her week. So at the heart of forgiveness then is reconciliation. And that's so much the engine behind what Jesus came to do. And we saw it lived out in Bob's life. And I love that it's Martin Luther King weekend in terms of at the funeral, there were so many men of color that were there. One of the men who spoke, his name was Johnny. Johnny is a dapper African American. So he's my dad's age, in his 80s. He told stories of driving in his Cadillac with my dad, just out cruising. And remember the kind of dad that I grew up with? And I said, how in the world? It's like my dad's soul, his soul was healed, cured. And none of us get completely there. But the idea that he was cruising with Johnny in L.A., in his Cadillac, we looked at each other, and I'll close with this. My siblings just all say, when we think back to those times, they say, it's a miracle. It's a miracle. And so in many ways, as you think back to the start of my talk, and it was a rough road. It was a rough road. And it doesn't always end nicely, but we saw God's faithfulness in Bob's life. We saw God's faithfulness in our life as a family. So, thank you. Thank you for honoring me by hearing this story of forgiveness with me and my dad. Amen.